Sometimes life throws you a curveball so absurd, so outrageously unjust, that all you can do is stand there for a moment, blinking, wondering if you've slipped into some alternate reality. That's where I found myself not too long ago. Have you ever been underestimated? I mean, truly, profoundly underestimated by someone who should have known better? Or maybe you've had your own run-in with an HOA that seemed to think it was a sovereign nation. Let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely like to hear your stories because mine's a bit of a doozy. It's a story about a quiet life interrupted, a father's love tested, and a so-called homeowners association that picked a fight with the wrong man. They tried to use their petty rules to take my son. What they didn't count on was that I'm a retired Navy SEAL. And by the end of one very long night, their little empire, their reign of arrogance, it simply didn't survive. My name is Michael Rourke, though most just call me Mike. For 20 years, the Navy, specifically the SEAL teams, had been my life. It was a world of precision, discipline, and understanding the stakes. But I traded my trident for a lunchbox, my combat boots for sneakers more suited to chasing an energetic 8-year-old. My son Leo, he was and is my entire world, especially since losing his mom, my Sarah, to cancer just 6 months prior. Her dream had always been a house with a yard, a quiet street where Leo could ride his bike, a place called Harmony Creek. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, a place to heal and build a new kind of normal. I was just a dad, trying to honor my late wife's wishes, trying to give my son the peaceful childhood she'd envisioned. My past, the skills honed in deserts and shadows, were meant to stay there, dormant, relics of a former life. I was just another grieving widower, new to the neighborhood, focused on school drop-offs and bedtime stories. Or so I appeared. Harmony Creek, on the surface, was everything Sarah had pictured. Manicured lawns, freshly painted houses, kids playing in the cul-de-sacs. But every paradise, it seems, has its serpent. Ours was named Bartholomew Sterling. He was the president of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, a man whose physical girth was matched only by the expansiveness of his ego. Sterling was always impeccably, if fussily, dressed, his voice a low, condescending drawl that seemed to vibrate with self-importance. He, along with his 2 bored acolytes, Ms. Agnes Periwinkle, the rail-thin secretary with a perpetually pinched expression, and Mr. Horace Grumbles, the treasurer whose name perfectly matched his demeanor, ruled Harmony Creek with an iron fist clad in a velvet glove of feigned community spirit. My initial interactions were minor, almost laughable. A polite but firm note about my grass being a 1/4 inch too high. A passive-aggressive email regarding the precise angle at which my recycling bin needed to be placed on the curb. Sterling, I observed, seemed to derive an almost perverse pleasure from this micromanagement, this assertion of his petty dominion. I dealt with tyrants on a much grander scale. This was just annoying, or so I thought. The shift from nuisance to nightmare came swiftly, delivered with Sterling's trademark oily smile during what he'd termed an informal community standards review. He'd summoned me to the HOA's small, stuffy office in the community clubhouse. He sat behind his oversized desk, Ms. Periwinkle and Mr. Grumbles flanking him like gargoyles. "Mr. Rourke," he began, steepling his fingers, "we, the board, have been reviewing your situation." He let the word hang in the air, ripe with unspoken judgment. He then proceeded to cite a series of obscure, and to my ear, suspiciously convoluted HOA bylaws. Bylaws I'd never seen in the welcome packet. Bylaws that, according to him, pertain to household stability and maintaining optimal community, child-rearing environments. He droned on about the importance of a traditional family structure for property values and community cohesion. Then came a gut punch. "Frankly, Mr. Rourke," he said, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing sort of zeal, "your status as a single, recently bereaved father, while tragic, presents certain inconsistencies with the established Harmony Creek domestic standards. We have concerns about the suitability of the environment for young Leo." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "There are provisions, Mr. Rourke, within our bylaws that allow the association to engage with relevant child welfare authorities if community standards are persistently breached. For the child's well-being, of course, wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war. He was implying, with a smug certainty that made my blood run cold, that this fake HOA, this glorified neighborhood watch with delusions of grandeur, had the power to take my son. For a beat, I just stared. Shock, cold and sharp, pierced through me. Then came the heat, a familiar, controlled burn that started deep in my chest. My son? They want to interfere with my raising of Leo? After everything Sarah and I fought for, after everything I've tried to build for him, it was as if a switch had been flipped. The grieving widower, the unassuming new neighbor, receded. The part of me that had faced down armed hostiles, that had planned and executed missions where lives hung in the balance, that part snapped to attention. This wasn't about lawn height anymore. This was a direct assault on the very core of my existence. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "are you threatening my custody of my son based on some trumped-up HOA rule?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Threatening is such an ugly word, Mr. Rourke. We prefer to think of it as proactive community stewardship, right?" My decision was made in that instant. This wasn't just about defending my rights. It was about dismantling Sterling's corrupt little fiefdom before he could harm anyone else. He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The walk home was a blur of cold fury and rapidly forming strategy. My SEAL training, long dormant in this suburban setting, surged to the forefront. Threat assessment. Sterling was the primary. Periwinkle and Grumbles his immediate support. The bylaws were his weapon. Information gathering became paramount. I needed to understand the terrain, the enemy's disposition, his strengths, and, more importantly, his weaknesses. My mind, accustomed to deconstructing complex operational challenges, began to dissect the Harmony Creek HOA. It was no longer a civilian organization. It was an objective. The first step was reconnaissance. I started observing Sterling with a new intensity. His routines, his habits, who he met with, the way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching. He had a predictable schedule: coffee at the local diner at 7 a.m., a slow drive through the neighborhood peering at lawns, then to the HOA office. He favored a particular brand of expensive, ill-fitting suit. He sweated a lot. Small details, but details mattered. My first official countermove was deceptively simple. I sent a polite, registered letter to the HOA, formally requesting a complete copy of all current bylaws, amendments, meeting minutes for the past 5 years, and detailed financial statements. Sterling's response was a condescendingly worded email from Ms. Periwinkle, implying I was wasting their valuable time, but they were legally obligated to comply, albeit slowly. When a mountain of paperwork finally arrived, I spread it across my dining room table, Sarah's table, where we'd planned our future. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I waded through the documents, patterns began to emerge. Vague catch-all phrases, bylaws that seemed to contradict each other, amendments, particularly recent ones, that were poorly drafted and suspiciously self-serving, granting more and more discretionary power to the board. The specific bylaw Sterling had quoted regarding household stability was buried deep, almost an afterthought. Its wording was so ambiguous it could mean anything or nothing. It reeked of being custom designed for intimidation. I also started talking very casually to my neighbors. A chat while getting the mail, a friendly wave that turned into a longer conversation at the park. Most were clearly intimidated by Sterling, complaining in hushed tones about his overreach, but feeling powerless. A few, however, had a spark of defiance in their eyes. The kindling was there. It just needed a flame. The first spark came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, a woman in her late 70s, lived 2 streets over. She was one of Harmony Creek's original homeowners, sharp as a tack, with a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood and a gaze that missed nothing. I'd helped her with a fallen tree branch a few weeks back, and she'd invited me in for iced tea. When I cautiously broached the subject of the HOA, her eyes narrowed. Bartholomew Sterling, she said, her voice laced with a disdain that Sterling himself would have struggled to match, is a pompous, grasping little man. This HOA wasn't always like this, you know. It used to be about, well, community. She became my first and most valuable ally. Eleanor possessed a treasure trove of old HOA documents, minutes from meetings dating back 20 years, and a clear memory of how Sterling had gradually consolidated power, twisting the original intent of the association. She was the insider, the historian. Soon after, David Chun joined our quiet rebellion. He was a young lawyer, recently moved in with his wife and new baby. Sterling had tried to fine him an exorbitant amount because his son's brightly colored plastic slide was visible from the street. Deeming it aesthetically disruptive, David had pushed back legally, and Sterling had grudgingly retreated, but the encounter left a sour taste. David saw the danger in Sterling's unchecked authority and the questionable legality of many of the newer bylaws. He was a fellow victim, now an ally with a law degree. A few other homeowners, emboldened by Eleanor's standing and David's professional expertise, started attending our discreet evening meetings in Eleanor's living room, sharing their own stories of Sterling's petty tyrannies. With Eleanor's historical documents and David's legal eye, we began to dig deeper. The picture that emerged was uglier than I'd initially suspected. The original HOA charter was simple, focused on maintaining common areas and little else. Sterling's amendments, often passed in sparsely attended meetings or via questionable proxy votes, had systematically expanded the board's power. David flagged several bylaws that were almost certainly unenforceable, possibly illegal, including the one Sterling was using to threaten me. This isn't just an overzealous HOA, I thought. This is potentially a fraudulent operation. My own reconnaissance started yielding fruit. I noticed Sterling having regular, quiet lunches at an out-of-the-way restaurant with a man I eventually identified as Marcus Vinnie Thorne, a principal at Vulture Holdings, a notoriously aggressive local development company known for buying up land, often through contentious means for high-density, low-quality projects. Why was the president of our sleepy suburban HOA meeting with a shark like Thorne? The financial statements, once David and I deciphered their deliberately obfuscated formatting, told an even more damning story. Contract for landscaping, security, even simple repairs were consistently awarded to the highest bidders. Companies that, with a little more digging, proved to be shell corporations with opaque ownership structures. The amounts were inflated, sometimes ludicrously so. Kickbacks, embezzlement. Sterling and his cronies weren't just on a power trip. They were likely lining their pockets. The fake HOA, moniker for my internal thoughts, felt increasingly accurate. This wasn't about community standards. It was about greed and control, pure and simple. Sterling, however, wasn't idle. Perhaps he sensed the shift in the neighborhood's undercurrent, the quiet meetings, the sudden interest in HOA documents. Or perhaps it was simply his nature to escalate when challenged. He doubled down. I received a flurry of new violation notices. My garden hose was coiled improperly. A small crack in my driveway was deemed a structural hazard. Leo's bicycle, left for an hour on the porch, was a persistent eyesore. The fines attached were ludicrous. Then, he made his most direct move yet. An anonymous call was made to Child Protective Services, citing concerns about Leo's unstable home environment. My heart hammered in my chest when the social worker, a kind but thorough woman named Ms. Davies, arrived at my door. Thankfully, Sarah and I had always maintained a loving, immaculate home. Leo was bright, happy, and clearly well cared for. Ms. Davies, after a comprehensive visit and a chat with a slightly bewildered Leo, who mostly wanted to show her his Lego Millennium Falcon, left with assurances that she saw no cause for concern whatsoever, and even a hint of apology for the intrusion. Sterling's maneuver had backfired, but it was a chilling reminder of his ruthlessness. He clearly felt untouchable. At a sparsely attended quarterly HOA meeting, which Eleanor and I made a point of attending, he actually boasted about maintaining the highest standards and dealing decisively with elements that seek to undermine Harmony Creek's prestige. His arrogance was his Achilles heel. He was practically daring us to challenge him. The CPS stunt was the final straw. It was time to move from defense and investigation to offense. In Eleanor's sun-drenched living room, surrounded by stacks of documents and David's legal pads, we formulated our plan. It wasn't going to be a quiet takedown. Sterling thrived in the shadows and backrooms. This needed to be public, decisive, and undeniable. He uses the bylaws as his sword and shield, David said, tapping a particularly egregious clause. We need to turn that back on him. Show everyone how he's twisted them, how he's broken them, how the entire edifice he's built is rotten to the core. Our strategy was multi-pronged, a coordinated assault on his power base. First, we would compile every piece of evidence. The financial irregularities, the doctored meeting minutes Eleanor had painstakingly cross-referenced with her originals, statements from overcharged vendors willing to speak off the record, the clear timeline of bylaw manipulation. Second, David would draft formal legal challenges to the most offensive bylaws, including the one threatening me, and prepare a demand for an immediate, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Third, and this was crucial, we needed to mobilize the silent majority of homeowners. Eleanor, with her long-standing connections and unimpeachable reputation, would be key here. We would call for a special meeting of the HOA, as per the original charter's provisions, a provision Sterling had conveniently overlooked in his revised documents. The objective, a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Sterling, Periwinkle, and Grumbles. The night they didn't survive was taking shape, not as a physical confrontation, but as a meticulous dismantling of their authority. My SEAL training in strategic planning, identifying vulnerabilities, and coordinating assets was proving invaluable. Sterling's arrogance, his belief in his own untouchability, his sloppy paper trail, these were his critical weaknesses. As we laid our groundwork, Sterling continued his maneuvers, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He pushed forward with a proposal, suspiciously timed, for a beautification project that involved selling off a little-used common green space, prime land adjacent to a parcel already owned by Vulture Holdings. The improvements he promised were vague, the costs exorbitant. It was clear he was trying to ram through one last profitable deal for himself and his developer crony before, well, he didn't anticipate, and before he also attempted to further intimidate known dissenters. One elderly gentleman who had openly questioned Sterling at the last meeting received a notice that his prize-winning roses were somehow violating a new, unannounced flora conformity bylaw. The stakes were undeniably rising. The threats, though veiled, felt more personal. Sterling was a cornered animal, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. He'd made comments to other board sympathizers about outsiders and people who don't understand our ways, clearly aimed at me. The thought of Leo being caught in any crossfire, however indirect, hardened my resolve. This had to be clean, swift, and absolute. There was no room for error. This ends now, I vowed silently, reviewing the evidence we'd compiled. For Leo, for Sarah's dream, for this community. The night of the special HOA meeting arrived, charged with an electric tension. We had chosen the community clubhouse auditorium, the largest venue available, and it was packed. Word had spread like wildfire, fueled by Eleanor's quiet but persistent networking and a carefully worded, anonymous summary of our findings slipped under every door in Harmony Creek. Sterling, Periwinkle, and Grumbles sat at a table on the stage. Looking initially smug, though a flicker of unease crossed Sterling's face as he surveyed the unexpectedly large and decidedly undeferential crowd. He tried to open with his usual platitudes, but the homeowners were restless. This wasn't going to be one of his stage-managed farces. As per the agreed agenda, which David had forced through by citing the original charter, I was the first to speak. I walked to the podium, not with aggression, but with the calm, focused demeanor I'd learned in situations far more perilous. Good evening, everyone. I began, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. My name is Michael Rourke. Many of you know me as Leo's dad. What you may not know is why I, along with Mrs. Ainsworth and Mr. Chun, felt it necessary to call this meeting. I laid it out, piece by piece. The financial discrepancies, presenting enlarged copies of doctored invoices and questionable contracts. The pattern of bylaw manipulation, showing how rules were bent, broken, or invented to suit the board's agenda. I spoke of the Vulture Holdings connection, the secret meetings, the proposed land sale that benefited a developer far more than the community. I kept my tone even, factual, letting the evidence speak for itself. My SEAL training had taught me that the most effective debriefs were clear, concise, and irrefutable. Sterling attempted to interrupt, to bluster, to dismiss my claims as slander and misinformation from a disgruntled newcomer, but the mood in the room had shifted. Homeowners, armed with the anonymous summary and now hearing the detailed evidence, began to murmur, then to ask pointed questions. Ms. Periwinkle was visibly pale, her hands trembling as she shuffled papers. Mr. Grumbles looked like he might actually live up to his name and spontaneously combust. The turning point came when David Chun took the podium. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He calmly, methodically outlined the legal anachronisms, the procedural violations, the outright illegalities of many of the HOA's recent actions. He cited case law. He spoke of fiduciary duty and its flagrant breach. Then he formally served Sterling, right there on stage, with a legal notice demanding an immediate cessation of enforcement of the household stability bylaw targeting me, and a petition signed by over 60% of Harmony Creek homeowners demanding a full, independent forensic audit and the immediate resignation of the board. Sterling's face, which had been contorting through various shades of red and purple, went slack. His arrogance, his primary weapon, shattered against the wall of cold, hard facts and unified community outrage. He looked around wildly, as if seeking an escape route, but he was surrounded. The crowd, once cowed, was now empowered. They saw him for what he was, not a pillar of the community, but a cheap con man. For a breathless moment, there was a flicker of Sterling's old defiance. He slammed his gavel down. "This meeting is out of order," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "I will not stand for this mutiny." He gestured vaguely towards the single, bewildered-looking part-time security guard near the door, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Remove these troublemakers." But no one moved to help him. The security guard just looked at his shoes. The homeowners weren't shouting, but a low, angry growl filled the room. The tide had not just turned. It was a tsunami. Sterling's power, built on fear and deception, had evaporated under the bright lights of scrutiny. Ms. Periwinkle began to openly weep. Mr. Grumbles just stared blankly ahead, a broken man. The carefully constructed facade of the Harmony Creek HOA, Sterling's personal kingdom, had crumbled. His reign, his scheme, his illegitimate authority, none of it survived that night. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The vote of no confidence in Sterling, Periwinkle, and Grumbles was nearly unanimous. They were summarily dismissed from the board, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror as they gathered their papers and scurried off the stage, enduring a gauntlet of icy stares. As if on cue, a local investigative reporter, whom Eleanor had discreetly tipped off, arrived with a cameraman, just in time to capture the fallout and conduct impromptu interviews with jubilant homeowners. David formally handed over our entire dossier of evidence to two police detectives who had been quietly observing from the back of the auditorium, also alerted by an anonymous, civic-minded source. The threat that Sterling and his cronies had wielded, the threat that had hung over my family, was gone. The bylaws they'd used to terrorize and extort were rendered null and void, pending a full review. As I walked out of the clubhouse into the cool night air, Leo's small hand tucked securely in mine, I felt a wave of profound relief wash over me. Justice. It wasn't the kind I'd dispensed in other parts of the world, but it was justice nonetheless. Sarah would have been proud. We had saved her dream of Harmony Creek. In the weeks that followed, Harmony Creek began to transform. An interim committee, which included a reluctant but committed David Chun and a revitalized Eleanor Ainsworth, was formed. Their first task was to cooperate fully with the ongoing police investigation and the forensic auditors, who were uncovering even more layers of Sterling's financial chicanery. The old, oppressive bylaws were systematically reviewed and overhauled, replaced with sensible, transparent guidelines truly designed to benefit the community. The green space Sterling had tried to sell to Vulture Holdings was officially dedicated as Sarah's Park, a playground and community garden, a small tribute that brought tears to my eyes. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed palpably. People were friendlier, more open. Block parties were organized. There was a sense of shared ownership, of a community reclaimed. Leo thrived. He loved Sarah's Park, and the cloud of anxiety that had unknowingly hovered over our little family lifted completely. My life returned to its new normal: school runs, helping with homework, weekend adventures with my son. I was just like Leo's dad again. Though I did find myself occasionally advising the new HOA committee on procedural matters and security, my old skills finding an unexpectedly peaceful application. The wider community of Harmony Creek had learned a valuable lesson about vigilance and the power of collective action. They had seen firsthand how easily authority could be abused if left unchecked. As for Bartholomew Sterling, Ms. Periwinkle, and Mr. Grumbles, the local news eagerly reported on their arrests a few weeks later, followed by indictments for fraud, embezzlement, and a host of other charges. Their assets were frozen. Their reputations were in ruins. They lost their homes, their standing, everything they had built on deceit. Vulture Holdings, implicated in some of the shadier dealings, found itself under intense scrutiny, its proposed projects in the wider county suddenly facing new, very critical reviews. So what's the takeaway from all this? For me, it's a reminder that courage isn't just about facing bullets. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're outnumbered, even when the fight seems mundane, like battling a corrupt HOA. It's about protecting your family and your community with whatever skills you possess. My SEAL training taught me to be resourceful, to be strategic, to never give up. Those lessons were forged in the crucible of war, but they served me just as well in the quiet streets of suburbia. The true night they didn't survive wasn't about violence. It was about the death of their deception, the collapse of their illegitimate power under the weight of truth and collective will. Sometimes, the quietest battles, the ones fought with documents and determination rather than weapons, can bring about the most profound and satisfying victories for justice. This new peace, this genuine harmony in Harmony Creek, is a legacy Sarah would have loved. And for Leo and me, it's a future we can finally embrace without fear. What do you think is the most important quality when facing down a bully, big or small? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for listening to my story.